For most of human history, up until about 12,000 years ago, people lived in small groups and relied on hunting and gathering for food. But as they discovered farming, they began to settle in one place and grow crops. Changing to an agricultural system brought more stability and allowed communities to grow larger. An important change compared to previous times was the priority for communities to control the land they used for farming. Some of these early farming communities became more successful than others. This was because some land was better for farming, and so can produce more food. Some communities were also better organized than others. This was because they had better ideas and better technology. These successful communities became more powerful and started to grow. Of course, conflict was one way they grew. Over a long period of time, the more successful communities became large empires. Territories ruled by a single leader, like a king or an emperor. These empires expanded their control over many different lands and peoples. They were similar to modern states, but also different in some important ways. Even though many people lived within these large empires, most people lived and died in their local community. Most people did not travel very much, and most people did not interact very much with people outside their local community. We could simply say that their identity came from their family, their community, and their religion. Identity is the answer to the question, who am I? We will return to this topic a little later in the lecture. This is a very simple look at the pre-modern world, but the topic of this lecture is the creation of states and the modern interstate system. In international relations, we often say that the modern nation-state and the modern interstate system began with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Of course, this is really too simple, but it does help us to understand what a state is. The Treaty of Westphalia was an agreement that ended a long and destructive war in Europe. This was the 30 Years' War, and although it was basically a religious war, it was also a war for independence from the Catholic Church based in Rome. Many of the kings and queens of Europe wanted to rule their countries independently. We could say that they wanted to make independent political communities or nation states. Therefore, the Treaty of Westphalia allowed the kings and queens to make their own independent territories. The Netherlands, for example, was made at this time, and also created some rules for how these nation states could interact. These rules and ideas laid the foundation for the modern interstate system. An important idea was sovereignty, which means that the state is independent and can control its territory by itself. The idea is a little difficult, but it also means that each state recognizes other states as being legitimate, meaning that they accept the authority of the state. Connected to this is another important principle, non-interference, and this means that the state will not interfere in the domestic affairs of another state. At the same time, trade between nations across large distances began to increase. It was a kind of early globalization. As with the early empires, some of these new nation states were more successful than others. Some grew to be much more powerful than others. New technologies, such as sailing ships and weapons, were important in giving some nation states much more power than others. These states, all from Europe, began to gain control of large areas of the world, and this became known as imperialism, or the building of empires. As we previously said, empires are as old as human civilization, and all successful groups have expanded their territory. But with European imperialism, these empires became global. The current states of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States of America all began as being part of the British Empire. The scientific revolution and the industrial revolution increased the gap in power between the states of Europe and the areas they colonized. Another way of looking at this is that the states of Europe were modern and the peoples of other areas were not. Modern science and industry were important parts of these modern nation states. But another important part was nationalism. Before the modern nation states, the identities of most people were local and religious. However, nationalism created new national identities and connected people into large national communities. As explained earlier, the 30 Years' War was fought to gain independence for the nations of Europe. The same thing would happen to the European empires. Many people around the world living in the European empires wanted independence too. They wanted to govern themselves and make their own decisions. This movement for independence is called decolonization. Decolonization happened over a long period of time. First, America became independent from Britain. Then the countries of South and Central America became independent from the Spanish and Portuguese empires. For example, Peru gained independence in 1821 from Spain, and Brazil gained independence from Portugal in 1825. Throughout the 20th century, and particularly after World War II, most of the European colonies became independent. For example, Egypt in 1922, India in 1947, and Zimbabwe in 1980. This increased the number of countries. In the year 1900, there were 78 nation states, but by the 21st century, there were over 200. Today, the global system of modern nation states is made up of independent countries. Each country has its own government, laws, and cultural identity. They interact with each other through diplomacy, trade, and international cooperation. It's like a big family of nations, where each member has its own unique characteristics and contributes to the global community. In summary, the creation of the global system of modern nation states began with the transition to agriculture, the rise and fall of empires, and the desire for individual rights and freedoms during the period of modernity. The Treaty of Westphalia recognized the importance of independent territories and laid the groundwork for the nation-state system. Imperialism led to the colonization of lands, followed by decolonization and the emergence of independent nations. Economic development became a focus for countries in the modern era.